This is the street where it happened, right here, this exact ground. Where you're looking right now, this used to be the wealthiest black neighborhood in the entire United States of America. They called it Black Wall Street, and in 36 hours, the American government, the American police, and American citizens burned every single inch of it to the ground, then buried it for 100 years. No textbooks, no memorials, no apologies, just silence. Stay until the end of this video, because what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 is not just black history, it is not just American history. It is the story of what happens when an entire nation decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to remember. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what was built, because that is the part they never want you to know. In the early 1900s, in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, something extraordinary was happening. Black Americans who had survived slavery, survived Reconstruction, survived Jim Crow laws that were designed specifically to keep them poor, powerless, and afraid, had done something that was never supposed to be possible. They had built an empire. Greenwood Avenue was lined with black-owned hotels, black-owned law offices, black-owned hospitals, black-owned newspapers, black-owned theaters and restaurants and jewelry stores. There were black doctors treating black patients in fully equipped medical offices, black lawyers defending black clients in courtrooms, black teachers educating black children in schools that rivaled anything in white Tulsa. The Stratford Hotel, a 6-story luxury building, was one of the largest black-owned hotels in the entire country. O.W. Gurley, a Harvard-educated entrepreneur, owned an entire city block. There were 2 black newspapers, a black library, a black hospital. At its peak, over 10,000 black Americans lived and thrived in Greenwood. They called it Black Wall Street because the money circulated within the community so efficiently, a single dollar would change hands 19 times before it ever left the neighborhood. 19 times. Now ask yourself, why have you never heard this story in school? Because what comes next is why they buried it. May 30th, 1921. A 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland steps into an elevator in downtown Tulsa. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. Exactly what happened inside that elevator? Nobody knows for certain. The most likely explanation, supported by later investigations, is that Rowland stumbled, perhaps stepped on her foot, perhaps grabbed her arm to steady himself. Sarah Page. Someone heard, and that scream, in 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma, was enough to end a civilization. The next morning, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune ran a front-page headline, "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." That headline was a match dropped into a room soaked in gasoline. By that afternoon, a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. They wanted one thing, a lynching. Now here is the part of the story that fills you with both pride and grief at the same time. Word spread to Greenwood fast, and the black men of Tulsa, many of them World War I veterans who had literally fought for this country in the trenches of Europe, they made a decision. They armed themselves, and they marched to the courthouse to protect Dick Rowland. Somewhere between 25 and 75 armed black men stood outside that courthouse and told the white mob, plainly, clearly, without flinching, "You will not take him." For a moment, just a moment, it worked. The mob hesitated, but then a white man in the crowd approached one of the black veterans and demanded he hand over his weapon. The veteran refused. A shot was fired. Nobody knows who fired first. It does not matter, because what happened next had nothing to do with Dick Rowland. It never did. Dick Rowland was just the excuse. What happened next was a massacre that had been building for years, fueled by economic jealousy, racial hatred, and the unbearable sight of black Americans succeeding in a country that had been designed to make that impossible. The shooting outside the courthouse sent both sides scattering. The black veterans retreated back to Greenwood. The white mob grew. By nightfall on May 31st, thousands of white Tulsans, armed with rifles, pistols, and torches, had gathered at the edge of Greenwood. The Tulsa Police Department did not try to stop them. The Tulsa Police Department joined them. Officers handed out weapons to white civilians. They deputized members of the mob on the spot, giving them legal authority to, quote, "shoot any Negro on sight." Let that land for a moment. The police, deputizing a mob to shoot black Americans on sight. This was not a riot that got out of control. This was a coordinated, state-assisted massacre. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, the shooting began. White gunmen fired into Greenwood from the edges of the neighborhood. Black residents fired back from windows and rooftops, defending everything they had spent their entire lives building. The fighting was intense. It was bloody on both sides. But Greenwood was outnumbered 10 to 1. And then, the morning came. June 1st, 1921. At the first light of June 1st, 1921, the people of Greenwood looked up at the sky, and what they saw stopped their hearts. Airplanes, private planes, and possibly National Guard aircraft were circling above Greenwood. Witnesses, black residents who survived, reported that those planes were firing rifles and dropping incendiary devices onto buildings below. The Oklahoma National Guard had been mobilized, but not to protect black Tulsans, to assist in their destruction. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, a whistle blew, and the white mob, thousands strong, now armed, deputized, and organized, invaded Greenwood from multiple directions simultaneously. What followed in the next few hours is almost impossible to comprehend. Buildings were set on fire while people were still inside them. Families trying to flee were shot in the streets. Black men were marched at gunpoint to detention centers, internment camps, while their homes burned behind them. Women and children ran. Some made it, many did not. Hospitals were burned, churches were burned, schools were burned. The Stratford Hotel, that magnificent 6-story landmark, was burned to the ground. In less than 16 hours, over 35 city blocks were completely destroyed. 1,256 homes burned. Hundreds of businesses gone. A black hospital, a black library, a black school system, all of it ash. And the people? Official records claimed 36 dead, but investigators who dug into this story decades later believe the true death toll was somewhere between 100 and 300 people, black Tulsans, many of whom were buried in unmarked mass graves that were only beginning to be located in 2020. Nearly a century later, the fires were still burning when the cover-up began. The Tulsa Tribune, the same newspaper that had published the inflammatory headline that started everything, pulled that original front page from its archives, physically removed it. For decades, if you went looking for that edition in the Tulsa Tribune's own records, it was simply gone, cut out, as if it never existed. The Oklahoma state government launched no serious investigation. No white rioters were ever charged, ever prosecuted, ever convicted, not one. The survivors, traumatized, homeless, their life's work reduced to rubble, were told by the city that they would receive no compensation, no rebuilding funds, nothing. In fact, the city tried to rezone Greenwood so that it could never be rebuilt as a residential neighborhood. The survivors fought that. They rebuilt anyway, with their bare hands, in the winter, with no help from anyone. But the story, the actual story of what happened, was erased from newspapers, from official records, from school textbooks across Oklahoma and across the country. An entire generation of American children grew up never knowing that Black Wall Street had ever existed, never knowing it had been burned to the ground by a mob assisted by the state. Never knowing that American aircraft had circled above American citizens and fired down at them. Never knowing about the mass graves. For 75 years, this massacre was not even mentioned in Oklahoma history textbooks. Not once. Of June 1st, 1921, she remembered white men coming into her family's home. She remembered them pulling her mother's beautiful lace curtains off the windows and using them to carry away everything her family owned. She became the first black woman to enlist in the United States Coast Guard. She spent her entire life telling anyone who would listen what she had seen. She was 103 years old when she finally testified before the United States Congress in 2019. 103 years old, still waiting for her country to acknowledge what had been done to her family, to her neighborhood, to her people. She died later that year, before Congress passed any formal recognition, before a single survivor received a single dollar of reparations, before America fully reckoned with what it had done. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre, as it is now officially called, existed only in whispers, in the memories of survivors passed down to children and grandchildren, in the work of a small number of historians who refused to let it die. It was not until 1996, 75 years after the massacre, that the Oklahoma state government commissioned its first official investigation. The Tulsa Race Riot Commission released its final report in 2001. It confirmed everything the survivors had always said. It recommended reparations. Those reparations were never paid. In 2020, following the nationwide reckoning with racial justice after the murder of George Floyd, the Tulsa Massacre finally broke into mainstream American consciousness. The HBO series Watchmen had depicted a fictionalized version of it in 2019. President Biden became the first sitting president to visit Tulsa and acknowledge the massacre on its 100th anniversary in 2021. And archaeologists began excavating potential mass grave sites in Oaklawn Cemetery, carefully, methodically, looking for the bodies that the city of Tulsa had tried to erase from existence. In 2023, they confirmed the presence of remains, 102 years later, still looking for the dead. Here is the question that this story demands we answer. How do you bury something this big? How does an entire country, a country that calls itself the land of the free, that puts liberty and justice for all on its most sacred documents, how does that country look away from the destruction of a thriving community, the murder of hundreds of its own citizens, and simply decide, we will not remember this? The answer is uncomfortable. You bury it the same way every atrocity gets buried, slowly, officially, institutionally. You remove it from the newspapers. You remove it from the textbooks. You make it impolite to discuss. You let the survivors age and die. You wait for the living memory to fade. And then one day, you wake up and an entire generation has been raised without knowing that Black Wall Street ever existed, without knowing what was taken, without knowing what was possible. Because that is the most dangerous part of this story. Not the massacre itself, as horrific as it was. The most dangerous part is what Black Wall Street represented before it was destroyed. It represented proof. Proof that with equal opportunity, even a fraction of equal opportunity, Black Americans could build something extraordinary, and that proof was so threatening to some people that they burned it to the ground rather than let it stand. The Greenwood district of Tulsa still exists today. It is not what it was. It never fully recovered. The descendants of the survivors still live there, still fight for recognition, still fight for reparations that have never come. But the story is no longer buried because of historians who refuse to stop digging, because of survivors like Olivia Hooker who refuse to stop talking, because of a younger generation of Americans who looked at their history books and said, something is missing here. The bullet holes in the walls of Greenwood are gone now, but the ground remembers, and now, so do you.